The boomer shooter genre, also known as retro shooters, have seen a myriad of examples, escalating from beginner-level projects to genre-defining and impactful projects like Dusk and Ultra Kill, two games that for me personally have set the gold standard on how to make a quality retro shooter, taking pre-existing gameplay loops and approaches to retrographic techniques in rendering and low-poly modeling, and heightening their implementation with unique mechanics or further improved movement and gunplay. However, Dusk and Ultra Kill are one of the few retro games to have not only grabbed my attention, but have also made a genuine impression on me, and what constitutes a boomer shooter, or a retro shooter as some would call it. And while we've gotten so many since Doom 2016 cracked open the dam, we've also gotten a lot that were well made and had a lot of passion behind them. But the market itself is becoming more and more saturated with games that don't really do enough to push the genre forward, and tend to blend in with their settings and their gameplay loops, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, mind you, it's just nothing groundbreaking. In fact, I've played a fair number of them, but I either didn't like them that much or felt like I was done with it the first time after finishing its campaign. Dusk and Ultra Kill are my two favourite boomer shooters though. But now I have three. HROT, developed and published by solo game developer Spytanev. HROT was an idea that could be traced as far back as '97, where the developer looked at games such as the first Quake and Chasm the Rift, and thought of making a game similar in those respects, with fast and addictive movement and gunplay, a blend of sci-fi and medieval aesthetics in the level design and its architecture, and retro-style graphics akin to late 90s shooters. In the case of HROT, it takes Quake's gameplay and blends it with an 80s Soviet-occupied depiction of a brutalistic state, filled with surreal and lifeless structures feeling void and empty, with not an echo of life beyond the real life like an uncanny hordes of enemies try to kill you. And all of it was done with its own custom engine written in the Pascal language, along with the GLC library. The game's setting is based off of real life locations within Czechoslovakia, during an unspecified incident during 1986. We never find out what the cause is, but from what we can see around us, and within the levels, something is not right. And your character begins going from level to level, killing whatever gets in his way. As for the plot, well, there isn't really a structured plot, not even by Quake or classic Doom standards. The developer instead wanted to let the atmosphere and the setting speak for itself, as well as the hidden snippets of local folklore and Easter eggs relevant to the history of Czechoslovakia. People have tried putting the pieces together for HROT's supposed story, and the working theory is that HROT actually revolves around the Horloge, which is the astronomical clock in Prague. It is said that if it is left unchecked and not maintained, the city of Prague will suffer. And this may correlate to the events surrounding the game's setting, and the presence of the game's enemies. In any event, the story isn't something to worry about here, but the atmosphere of the game's brutalist themes and depressing landscapes more than make up for it, and was interesting enough for me to want to learn more about its universe and why things turned out like this in the first place. The serious and depressing tone of HROT's world often takes a nosedive when we begin encountering stranger and more bizarre enemies, and not the kind that would shock or horrify you, but would leave you confused and wondering if it's all a big joke, or just a layer of surrealism in a world gone terribly wrong. Regardless, it's evident that the developer put a tremendous amount of effort into replicating a time capsule of Soviet history, with Easter eggs and references from movies like RoboCop or games like Quake, as well as referencing things from within its own culture and history. The interaction factor that HROT has is unparalleled compared to a lot of other shooters. You can flush toilets, take a shower, play on a retro console with an egg collecting minigame, play musical instruments, clean up a mess, ride a moped, kick a soccer ball, use a typewriter, get drunk, smash a pumpkin, give your dog Scooby snacks, you get the idea. There's a lot to enjoy beyond the smooth gunplay, and it breaks the monotonous nature of HROT's dystopian setting. As for the gunplay, the Pascal language isn't used as much nowadays anymore. Same goes for the GLC library. With engines like Unity and Unreal being a popular gateway for starting developers, there are some that will go out of their way to make their own engine, which is what this developer did, and the results are honestly quite amazing. Its gameplay loop follows directly from the first Quake, and it really shows. I hopped back into Quake and then HROT again, and could immediately notice the similarities between them, since the developers seemed to have Quake in mind during the game's development. The enemies themselves aren't that much different either in their function. It's their appearance and design that makes them stand out more. The weapon arsenal's alright. The two shotguns, the grenade launcher, and the crossbow were the standout weapons for me, with the grenade launcher acting more like a rocket launcher due to its trajectory. The power weapons didn't get much action due to not being able to find ammo for them often enough, but they are still satisfying to use. The pistol and the submachine gun, however, are pretty weak, mainly being used to conserve the ammo for other weapons pretty much. Enemies can punish you pretty quickly, and since you're out in the open often, you'll frequently fall victim to their incredibly fast projectiles, and while you can kick the grenades thrown at you from the grenadiers, it can get pretty chaotic, especially on the higher difficulties. HROT is quite challenging, but if you've played games like this before, then it's not that big of a deal to begin with. On the one hand, it doesn't feel as good as something like Dusk, but it feels just as good as Quake. And not only that, it also takes notes from Quake's own implementations of level design too, as well as a few nods to Dusk in terms of applying monster closets, teleports, linking enemies to key items that you pick up or when you go into another sector in the level. Despite all the levels looking pretty much the same, whether it's medieval based on real locales within the country, or 1980s Soviet brutalist architecture, the map has been interwoven in a way where you're not really running around like a headless chicken looking for the last key item. Level design is a very delicate thing. There's so many factors involved, like the balancing of enemies, the natural formation of ceilings and rooms, the availability of ammo, as well as special functions that make the level stand out more. I myself have been learning to make maps for classic Doom, and even in those games it's not very easy. Not a single level in HROT skips a beat here, and there's always something new and interesting to see. Combat is on a regular basis, and the boss fights are somewhat funny, scary, and fun at the same time, especially the last one in episode 3. Fundamentally speaking, the gameplay loop exists to pay homage to the original Quake, rather than trying to make something unique, which isn't always necessary to make a good game. You have 3 episodes now that the game is fully finished, an endless mode with 4 arenas, and a mode where you can play around with the horloge clock, which you get for completing episode 3. For extras, there's the bestiary and the minigame, as well as the recipes you receive for completing each episode, one in particular being a favourite of mine. HROT's overall experience is a pretty short one. Unless you're really hooked on the gameplay, you may be in it for a few playthroughs and that's it. There currently isn't much of a modding scene or one at all, but there are tools that have been provided by other people. However, in saying this, the game itself is very limited because from what I've read, any modified file that you implement in the game has to be exactly the same file size as the original one. So for the moment, I would look elsewhere for modding until the developer finds a way to make HROT moddable. The highlights of HROT are definitely the atmosphere and the gameplay. And the same extends to the graphics, which makes use of unfiltered textures and polygon jittering like a lot of these retro shooters do, that you can also see in the weapons that you use, the environments and the enemies that you see. The color palette of the game reflects the brutalist dystopia of HROT, and while the lack of color variety in Quake held it back, this game on the other hand does it purposefully to ground it in realism and history. Custom engines can perform wonders when implemented correctly, but it's something that you don't see very often because of how hard it actually is to make your own engine from scratch, compared to just making a game using existing frameworks or game engines like Unity and Unreal. The developer went to great lengths in making his idea possible, in both the gameplay and its functions, and the graphics. Audio is another thing that is hit and miss here. The weapon sounds went unnoticed for me, even while midst in the action. The music has some fantastic ambience and music that is intense, but not obnoxiously loud. It's the same with the first Quake, where there's nothing really wrong with it functionally, it's just kinda there and blends in with their respective atmospheres. The real beef stroganoff of HROT is, like I said, in the gameplay, the atmosphere of HROT's world, and of course, the interaction with objects. And that's HROT, a short but amazing shooter with a fantastic setting that is unique compared to a lot of other boomer shooters because of its attention to detail in both exploring its own lore and history of the country it's based upon, all the while distorting it with nightmarish and uncanny enemy designs, and gameplay that harkens back to the first Quake, a game that still holds up to this day. HROT is a love letter in disguise, so much so that you can even alter the position and scale of the weapons, centering it for that Quake 1 feel. Now that the game is finished with all 3 episodes, there's no better time than now to pick it up. Would love to see a sequel for it one day, or something else from the creator himself that carries the same spirit, because HROT is one of the best boomer shooters I've played, and regard it in the same light as Dusk and Ultra Kill. Thank you for watching.